The soft hum of neon lights pulsed against the dusky horizon as Logan eased his weathered Ford F-150 into the gravel lot of Murphy's Roadhouse and No Frills Bar, just off Route 66 in Oklahoma. The place wasn't much, just a familiar haunt for locals, long-haul truckers, and drifters looking for a stiff drink and a quiet seat. Logan had been stateside for a week now, fresh off his latest deployment. The noise of everyday life was already creeping back in: responsibilities, expectations, the endless pull of what came next. Tonight, though, he just wanted a few moments of solitude before he had to figure it all out. The wooden door groaned as he pushed it open, the scent of spilled beer and aged leather mingling in the air. Inside, the low murmur of conversation was underscored by the warm twang of a George Strait song crackling from an old jukebox. A quick scan of the room told him everything he needed to know: two guys at the pool table trading easy banter, a group at the bar clinking bottles in laughter, and a few lone drinkers lost in their own thoughts. Logan wasn't here to socialize. He wanted a drink, maybe two, then he'd be gone. He spotted a booth near the back, just enough in the shadows to be left alone, but with a clear view of the room. His fatigue still carried the dust of the desert, but his sneakers, scuffed and worn from too many miles, were the only part of him that looked out of place. He didn't care. Comfort beat appearance any day. Logan swirled the ice in his water glass, his thoughts drifting home. His mother's Sunday pot roast, the way his niece would come running at full speed to hug him, those were the things that had kept him going through the long months overseas. He was finally back, but it still didn't feel real. Then the door slammed open. A group of 6 men strode inside, their heavy boots striking against the scuffed wooden floor. They carried the weight of experience in their broad shoulders, their leather jackets adorned with patches that told a story only a certain kind of man would understand. Veterans, older, seasoned, and loud, their laughter filled the bar as they clapped each other on the back and made their way toward the counter. Logan barely spared them a glance before turning back to his drink, but one of them didn't just glance back. The leader, a thick-set man with a salt and pepper beard and sharp, calculating eyes, froze mid-laugh when he spotted Logan. His expression shifted, and he muttered something to the others. One by one, they turned to look, their amusement fading into something quieter, more deliberate. Logan felt their stares settle on him like a heavy weight, but he didn't react. He'd seen that look before, the one that sized you up, measured you against an unspoken standard. He focused on the jukebox instead, on the low twang of a country song barely cutting through the rising tension in the room. At the bar, the group huddled closer, their voices dropping to a murmur. The bearded leader said something under his breath, and one of the men chuckled dryly, shooting a glance in Logan's direction. Logan remained still, his body loose, his expression unreadable. Composure was second nature to him now, an instinct honed through years of training. But that didn't mean he wasn't aware. He felt the shift in the air before it even happened. The night, which had started as a quiet escape, was veering into something else entirely. The familiar hum of the jukebox was drowned out by the deliberate, measured thuds of approaching boots. The men were moving toward him, their leader at the front, eyes locked onto Logan like a wolf locking onto prey. Logan didn't flinch, but he felt the atmosphere around him change. The bar, once filled with easy chatter and clinking glasses, grew noticeably quieter. The bartender hesitated mid-pour, his gaze flicking toward the approaching men. A few regulars shifted in their seats, stealing wary glances at the scene unfolding before them. Something was about to happen, and Logan knew better than to ignore it. Logan set his glass down with a quiet clink and leaned back, his posture loose, relaxed. But beneath the surface, his muscles were taut, his senses sharpening. He'd been in enough tense situations to recognize when something was about to go south. "Hey," the leader barked, stopping just a few feet from his table. His voice was rough, sandpaper over gravel, laced with a sneer. "Nice uniform you got there. Picked that up at a costume shop." The men behind him chuckled, the kind of laughter meant to provoke. Logan looked up, meeting the leader's gaze with an even stare. He'd heard worse, a hell of a lot worse. "It's mine," he said simply. "Earned it." The leader raised a skeptical brow, tilting his head like he'd just heard a bad joke. "Earned it, huh?" he mused. "That's funny, 'cause I've known real soldiers. And I ain't never seen one walk around in scuffed-up sneakers with their fatigues. You looking for sympathy? Maybe a free round?" Logan's jaw tensed, but his tone remained cool. "I don't need sympathy or free drinks. Just here to enjoy my evening." The leader smirked, leaning in just enough for Logan to catch the sour scent of beer on his breath. "You don't look like no soldier to me," he muttered. "Where's your boots? Your tags? Hell, I bet you don't even know how to salute right." One of the men behind him snickered. "Bet he couldn't tell us the first thing about basic training." Another chimed in, probably never seen a battlefield in his life. Their laughter grated against the low hum of the jukebox, filling the space between them like thick smoke. Logan remained still, his gaze flicking between their faces. He wasn't intimidated. That wasn't the problem. He'd dealt with men like this before, loud, insecure, desperate to measure themselves against someone else. But this was something different. It wasn't just their words. It was the sheer audacity, the ignorance. "I don't need to prove anything to you," Logan said finally, his voice quiet but firm. The leader's smirk faltered, irritation flickering behind his eyes. He stepped in closer, his broad frame casting a shadow over the table. "You think you're some kind of hero, huh, strolling in here like you belong?" The leader's voice was sharp, cutting through the thick silence of the bar. "I don't think you do." The room seemed to hold its breath. Logan met the man's stare, unflinching. "I've served 3 tours overseas," he said, his tone calm but edged with steel. "And I don't need your approval to belong anywhere." The laughter died. For a brief moment, something flickered in the leader's eyes. Hesitation, doubt. But pride was a stubborn thing, and he wasn't about to back down in front of his crew. Instead, he scoffed. "Yeah, prove it. Show us your tags. Otherwise, you're nothing but a liar." Logan's gaze swept over the group, catching the subtle shift in their demeanor. A few of them weren't as sure anymore. Their leader's accusations had cracked the confidence they carried in their chests, but none of them were willing to be the first to break ranks. Logan exhaled slowly, suppressing the urge to escalate. "I don't owe you proof," he said, his voice even. "But if you think starting something here is a good idea, I'd suggest you think again." The air in the bar was thick with tension. The bartender's hand hovered near the phone, ready to call the cops if this went sideways. Other patrons shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between Logan and the group of men like spectators at a high-stakes poker game. And yet, the leader didn't move. Instead, his smirk returned sharper, meaner. "You've got a smart mouth," he muttered, voice low and laced with threat. "Let's see if it's as quick as your fists." The moment stretched, tight as a tripwire. Then the leader lunged. His hand shot out, aiming for Logan's collar. The move was clumsy, driven by beer and bravado more than skill, but it was enough to set everything in motion. Logan didn't think. He reacted. Years of training took over. In one fluid motion, he sidestepped the grab, caught the man's wrist in midair, and twisted it behind his back. A sharp grunt of pain escaped the leader's lips as Logan used his momentum to shove him forward, slamming him face first against the table's edge. The wood groaned under the sudden impact, and the man let out a strangled yelp. The bar erupted in a mix of gasps and murmurs. The remaining bikers froze, their wide-eyed stares flicking between their immobilized leader and Logan, who hadn't even broken a sweat. For the first time that night, the balance had shifted. And Logan held all the cards. For a moment, no one moved. The bar hung in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on every person in the room. Then Logan's voice cut through the stillness, low, steady, and carrying an unmistakable authority. "I told you to think twice before starting something." He leaned in slightly, his grip firm but measured, controlled. "You don't know who you're messing with." The leader, Hank, as one of his buddies had called him, struggled, his body twisting against the hold, but it was useless. Logan wasn't some barroom brawler throwing wild punches. He was precise, calculated. Years of discipline had taught him exactly how much force to use, and right now, Hank had no leverage. Across the room, one of the bikers hesitated, then stepped forward, his hands raised slightly like a man caught between pride and self-preservation. "Hey man," he stammered, "let him go." He didn't mean nothing by it. Logan lifted his gaze, his eyes locking onto the man. He came at me. You saw it. His voice was calm, unshaken by the chaos crackling around him. "If you want him free, tell him to calm down first." The bartender, who had been silently gripping the phone behind the bar, finally found his voice. "Maybe it's time for you all to head out before this gets worse." A heavy beat passed. For a second, it looked like the tension might break. But Hank wasn't ready to back down. Even with his arm twisted, even with his face pressed against the worn wood of the table, his pride wouldn't let him just walk away. Through gritted teeth, he spat, "Call the cops. This guy just assaulted me. He's wearing a fake uniform, and I want him arrested." Logan let him go with a controlled shove, stepping back as Hank stumbled forward, rubbing his arm with a furious glare. "You'll pay for this," he growled, his voice thick with malice. The rest of the bikers rallied behind him, feeding off their leader's anger. One of them yanked out his phone with shaking hands, his thumb hovering over the screen. "Yeah, we got a guy here impersonating a soldier," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the bar to hear. "And he just assaulted my friend." The words hung in the air, charged and dangerous. And just like that, the night had taken a turn Logan hadn't expected. Logan stood still, his face unreadable, but his mind was already moving 10 steps ahead. He knew how this looked. He knew how fast a situation like this could spiral, especially with a call like the one they'd just made. Years of service, sacrifices most people couldn't even begin to understand. He wasn't about to let a bunch of loudmouths rewrite his story. Stay calm. The bar was alive with murmurs, now patrons whispering among themselves, stealing glances at him. Some looked wary, unsure of what to believe. Others, though, seemed quietly impressed by how effortlessly he had handled the situation. But none of them stepped forward. Then the sirens came. The wail cut through the thick night air, slicing through the bar's uneasy silence. Red and blue lights pulsed against the dusty windows, throwing flickering shadows across the room. The police had arrived. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and 2 officers stepped inside. The first was a broad-shouldered man with a close-cropped haircut, his expression unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. The second was a woman with sharp features, her gaze calm but assessing, taking in every detail of the room before she spoke. The weight of their presence sucked the air out of the room. "We got a call about an altercation," the male officer said, his voice steady, authoritative. "Someone want to explain what's going on here?" Hank, still clutching his wrist, was the first to speak. His face was red, half from anger, half from embarrassment, but his voice came out strong, fueled by wounded pride. "That guy assaulted me," he barked, pointing a trembling finger at Logan, "and he's impersonating a soldier. Look at him, he doesn't even have the right boots." The officer's gaze shifted to Logan, who stood unmoved by the accusation. His posture was loose, controlled. "Not defensive, just ready. That true?" The officer asked, his tone neutral but watchful. Logan met his gaze and shook his head slowly. "No, sir," he replied, his voice level. "This man and his friends confronted me because they didn't believe I was a real soldier. When he tried to grab me, I defended myself." The female officer took a step forward, her sharp eyes scanning the room, picking up on every subtle movement, every unspoken tension. "Did anyone witness what happened?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. A tense silence stretched for a beat too long. Then, from behind the bar, a voice cut through. "I saw it." All eyes turned toward the bartender. Hank stiffened. The bartender wiped his hands on a rag, his expression unreadable. Hank went after him first. The soldier just reacted to protect himself. It wasn't an assault. A heavy pause. Logan didn't move. He didn't need to. The truth had just spoken for itself. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Near the jukebox, a man spoke up. Yeah, he didn't start anything. Hank's been on edge since he walked in. The male officer turned his attention back to Logan. Do you have any proof of your service, sir? Logan gave a slow nod, keeping his movements deliberate. He gestured toward the duffel bag resting beside his table. In that bag, I've got my service uniform with my name and rank. My ID is in my wallet. You're welcome to take a look. The officer stepped forward, retrieving the bag and unzipping it carefully. Inside, the uniform was neatly folded, adorned with badges and insignias that spoke for themselves. He inspected it for a brief moment before glancing at his partner. She gave a small, knowing nod. The male officer turned back to Logan, his tone shifting firmer, but respectful. You're clear, he said. We appreciate your cooperation. Hank, still fuming, let out a growl. You're just gonna take his word for it. He could have faked all that. The female officer's sharp gaze snapped to him, cutting through the last remnants of his bravado. Enough, she said, her voice like a blade. From what I've heard, you instigated this. And you're lucky he's not pressing charges against you for assault. The words hit Hank like a slap. His jaw tightened, but he had no comeback. Around him, his crew shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding the floor a lot more interesting than meeting anyone's eyes. The male officer exhaled through his nose, giving Hank one last measured look. Here's how this is going to go, he said. We're filing a report on this incident. If you want to pursue your claims, you're welcome to do so. But you should know that false accusations, that's a serious matter. Hank's mouth opened, then closed again. He had no fight left. The officers took a step back, scanning the room one final time as the tension that had gripped the bar began to ease. The female officer turned to Logan. Thanks for keeping your cool, she said. We'll make sure this is documented correctly. Logan gave her a small nod, his composure unshaken. Thank you, officer. And just like that, the moment passed. But Logan knew this wasn't over, not really. The bikers shuffled out of the bar, their earlier bravado drained, replaced by stiff shoulders and averted gazes. Hank, still bristling, cast one last glare in Logan's direction before disappearing through the door. The officers followed soon after, and as the red and blue lights faded into the distance, the bar exhaled conversation slowly returning in hushed murmurs. Logan sat back down, his drink untouched. The weight of the encounter still lingered, but he was relieved it hadn't gone further. Around him, the other patrons exchanged quiet glances, their earlier skepticism replaced with something closer to respect. No one approached him, but the shift in the air was undeniable. A few days later, Logan was elbow-deep under the hood of his old Ford F-150, parked in the gravel driveway of his small home on the outskirts of Tulsa, Oklahoma. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the yard as he tightened a stubborn bolt, sweat beading at his temple. The memory of the bar incident still lingered, not because of the fight itself. He had faced worse in combat, much worse. But because of what it represented. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at him and decided they knew who he was. And it sure as hell wouldn't be the last. The distant crunch of tires on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. Logan straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, and turned to see a motorcycle rolling into the driveway. The rider was one of the guys from the bar. A wiry man with thinning hair and a leather jacket that looked a size too big. Logan recognized him, Bill, one of Hank's crew. The bike's engine cut off, and for a moment, neither man moved. Then, Bill swung his leg over the seat and hesitated before stepping closer. His posture was careful, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, like a man approaching a stray dog that might bite. Right? Bill asked, his voice quieter than Logan expected. Logan gave a slow nod but didn't speak. He wasn't in the habit of filling silence for other people's comfort. Bill cleared his throat, shifting on his feet. Wanted to come by and say I'm sorry for what happened at the bar. Logan raised an eyebrow, surprised but not entirely convinced. You were part of it, Logan said evenly. Bill nodded, his face flushing with guilt. "I know," he admitted. "I didn't stop it, and I should have. Hanky's got a way of riling people up, and I went along with it. But that doesn't make it right. I've been thinking about it ever since, and I just I just wanted to tell you that." Logan studied him for a moment, his sharp gaze taking in every detail. Bill's discomfort was clear the way he shifted on his feet, the way he couldn't quite meet Logan's eyes. But so was his sincerity. "Why now?" Logan asked, his tone steady. Bill shrugged, staring down at his boots like they held the answer. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, "and because, well, seeing you handle yourself the way you did it made me realize how wrong we were. You didn't deserve any of that." For a long moment, Logan said nothing. Then he exhaled, leaning back against the truck, arms crossed over his chest. "What do you want from me, Bill?" he asked. "Forgiveness." Bill looked up then, his eyes raw with something real. "Maybe," he admitted. "But more than that, I just I want to be better. I've seen a lot of hate in my life, and I don't want to add to it anymore. What we did was wrong, and I need to own up to it." Logan's expression softened, just slightly. He had heard apologies before, some genuine, some just words meant to smooth things over. This one felt different, not because of what Bill said, but because of the effort it took to show up at all. "I appreciate you coming here," Logan said finally. "It doesn't erase what happened, but it's a start." Bill nodded, relief flickering across his face. "Thanks, man, I mean it." He climbed back onto his bike, kicking up dust as the engine rumbled to life. Logan watched him pull away, a strange mix of emotions settling in his chest. The bar incident had been an ugly reminder of the prejudice he still faced, but Bill's apology that had been something else, a glimmer of hope. A small but meaningful step toward something better. Logan turned back to his truck, wiping his hands against the rag as the sun dipped lower in the sky, lost in thought. He knew the fight against ignorance wasn't over, but he also knew he wasn't alone in it. The choices he made, the way he carried himself, had the power to shift perspectives, one person at a time. The evening air was still, thick with the scent of warm earth and motor oil. In the distance, cicadas droned, their steady hum filling the quiet spaces between his thoughts. Logan exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he tightened the last bolt under the hood. He felt something settle inside him. Not just resolve, but purpose. Not just to keep moving forward, but to face the world with the same strength and integrity that had carried him through war zones and homecomings alike. Because sometimes the battles weren't fought overseas. Sometimes they were fought right here, in bars, in homes, in hearts. And as far as Logan was concerned, those battles mattered just as much.